credible historical possibility absent an underlying belief in teleology. The question is inspired by the work of the anthropologist David Scott, and more particularly by what he describes as the waning of the longing for total revolution that framed and animated the great modernist politics of emancipation, include indeed especially its anti-colonial and socialist forms. And I ask, what might emancipatory political thought look like? And I should say political thought and affect. I don't mean to actually not include affect here. I think it's extraordinarily important. Look like now that we can no longer appeal to the ideas of progress that have hitherto provided the theoretical underpinnings for that longing. Does collectively willed transformation, the kind to which leftist and anti-colonial movements have traditionally aspired, become impossible without a confidence in history's forward progress towards some sort of justice? And if not, how do we begin adjudicating what counts as an emancipatory politics today? Put another way, I want to explore the forms that political hope might take in the disappointing and exhausted ruins of our post-colonial and post-socialist present. And I am beholden to that formulation from Darragh Grant. I approach answers to these rather heady questions by privileging a core concept underpinning narratives of leftist collective transformation, namely by investigating anew the promise and limitations of the category dialectic. I begin by way of two theorists, Frantz Fanon, many of you in this room are experts on Fanon, and Slavoj Žižek, who are indebted to the Marxist revolutionary tradition of emancipatory politics and who wrestle with what it means to think dialectically. They do so in ways that avoid some of the pitfalls to which earlier revolutionary thought subscribed. The primary argument I advance is as follows. First, the tensions registered in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks suggest both the enduring power and certain limitations in Hegel's dialectic, which Fanon rightly regards as the conceptual inspiration for Marx and related constructions of historical progress and emancipation. Second, I argue that Slavoj Žižek's rereading of Hegel in the sublime object of ideology, as heterodox as it may be among scholars of Hegel, offers in juxtaposition with Fanon what might be a compelling way to repurpose the dialectic for the present. I then move to consider what I call the repurposed dialectic in action, taking the work of Syrian playwright Mohammad Al Attar as exemplary of an attitude of depressive realism, which offers one compelling approach to political transformation in the present. Now, by invoking the concept of the dialectic, I'm referring in the first instance to a well-recognized understanding of political dynamics, according to which historical progress is driven by contradictions between opposing forces, between theses such as authoritarian politics or rule, order, or capitalism, and antitheses such as revolutionary activism or freedom, or more specifically in the case of capitalism, proletarian revolutionary consciousness. The transcendence to be imagined here is not synthesis, as is often termed misleadingly, but sublation. The movement of history is dialectical because it's not simply a melding together of opposing phenomena, but remains defined by dynamic contradictions throughout. Opposed elements are both canceled and preserved, such that further considerations continue to be informed by the contradiction. In the famous case of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, it is both the master and the slave, or more correctly in Hegel, the lord and the bondsman, becoming cognizant of the lord's dependence on the bondsman that drives historical processes of overcoming. So to be sure, Black Skin, White Masks is not an obvious text for me to begin with here, for the book's engagement with the dialectic is at times difficult to parse and decidedly vexed. But I do so because the critique of Hegelian dialectics that can be extrapolated from Fanon's complications resonates profoundly with our own present predicaments, or so I want to suggest. The tensions in Fanon's account appear in the context of the difference he appreciates between the dialectic as a large-scale description of historical stages and the dialectic as an applied methodological understanding of social dynamics. The latter highlighting the generativity of antagonism and contradiction in the emergence of various forms of consciousness. Another advantage of starting with Black Skin, White Mask is that it focuses attention not as much on the explicit violence of the colonial order or the neo-colonial present, as on the systemic, taken for granted violence residing in the interstices of everyday life. So part one explores the implications for politics of what I see as Fanon's dual commitment in both not giving up on the dialectical imaginary needed to comprehend the violence and embracing the non-dialectical, some would say anti-dialectical, concept of amour fati found in Nietzsche. Part two is a very brief examination of Slavoj Žižek's creative take on Hegel, in which he enjoins us to accept what he calls the radical impossibility of our political visions, as opposed to pursuing the resolution of underlying contradictions. The founding idea here is that any, quote, provisional, temporarily successful solution of a particular problem entails an acknowledgement of the global radical deadlock, impossibility, the acknowledgement of a fundamental antagonism, unquote. Thinking politics from the standpoint of radical impossibility, I hope to show, beckons us to embrace the yes and no of Fanon's dialectical thinking. Part three considers the operations of the dialectic in Mohammad Al Attar's work by exploring everyday scenes of disappointment and loss. Set during the Syrian Revolution's devolution into war, his play, While I Was Waiting, written in 2017, and it's about 2015, 2016, brings to light the hard work of mourning amid the necessity of surviving the discomfortures of the present. It concretizes the felt elusiveness of the very standards of democracy and justice for which the characters in the play and so many Syrians in real life had been striving. The play helps us grapple with the unresolved antagonisms and radical impossibilities at the heart of dialectical thinking. And then I'm going to offer some concluding remarks. Ready? Charles Taylor used to say, okay, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to be flying at 35,000 feet, but we're not actually at that level. So in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon both registers and at times seems to become trapped in what Robert Young aptly calls an irresolvable dialectical bind between black and white, past and future, body and world, desire and insentience, consciousness and transcendent immanence. This dialectical bind reflects and is generated by Fanon's life as an anti-intellectual living in France and feeling alienated from both Black and white communities. And as scholars such as Arwa Awan have noted, this alienation is structural as well as personal, generating a philosophical tension which finds expression in his scholarly work, perhaps especially in Black Skin, White Masks. On the one hand, Fanon sees the world as composed of structural binaries that can seem at times fixed or almost brittly opposed. On the other hand, and more generatively, Fanon enjoins us to understand oppositions like blackness and whiteness as complex, socially constructed, variably experienced relational categories, whereas Young puts it, and I'm quoting again, whiteness and blackness are not absolute oppositions, but relative. You become white or black according to clothing, education, language, money, the look of others. And whereas Fanon often talks about, quote, the Negro, unquote, not only as a category, but as a unified set of shared experiences, he sometimes simultaneously insists on recognizing the heterogeneity of Black experience. Or to put this differently, Fanon's goal to raise the contradictions of structural racism to the level of conscious awareness prompted in him a form of mediated self-relation that was profoundly disruptive. He criticized the politics of negritude animating key contemporary thinkers, including his former mentor, Aimé Césaire, who for Fanon remained trapped in the terms of the very racial imaginary Césaire sought to negate. Rather than tarrying productively with the negative, Césaire's celebration of negritude, in Fanon's view, demonstrated how the concept fell short of the necessary task of exposing the contradictions in white supremacy. At the same time, citing its racist underpinnings, Fanon rejected Sartre's critique of negritude in Faustin Noir, connecting the text to his personal struggles with alienation and the complexities of identity. Fanon writes, "I wanted to be typically Black. That was out of the question. I wanted to be white. That was a joke. And when I tried to claim my negritude intellectually as a concept, they snatched it away from me," unquote. In a jab aimed specifically at Sartre, he explains, "They proved to me that my reasoning was nothing but a phase in the dialectic." To be sure, Fanon remained beholden to Sartre, yet by pointing to the racism at the heart of Sartre's analysis, Fanon shows that he rejects both negritude and any demeaning reading that would reduce negritude to a weak stage of history, as opposed to being importantly vibrant, visceral, and a complex instance of embodied experience in its own right. Sartre's description of alienation and the problematic existence of the other, while correct in terms of the account of alienated consciousness and being and nothingness, likewise falls short when applied to Black consciousness. Indeed, the application to Blacks as such is, quote, and I'm quoting Fanon here, fallacious because the white man is not only the other, but also the master, whether real or imaginary, unquote. Fanon's criticism of what he regards as Sartre's misapplied critique evokes some remnant attunement in negritude to the Black experience and its capacity to cultivate solidarity. But ultimately, Fanon is satisfied neither with Césaire's poetic exposition of negritude's political promise, nor with Sartre's dismissal. In a telling and famous footnote, Fanon details another important moment of theoretical self-discovery, evaluating what appear to be compelling concepts according to whether or how they accommodate Black experience. Now he asks what it would mean to apply Hegel's master-slave dialectic to the historical situation of Atlantic slavery, and again, the results leave him wanting. According to his observations in the Atlantic, the Black slave wants to be like his master. Therefore, he is less independent than the Hegelian slave. In Hegel, the slave turns away from the master and turns towards the object. Here, the slave turns toward the master and abandons the object. Of the master, he writes that here he differs basically from the master described by Hegel. For Hegel, there is reciprocity. Here, the master laughs at the consciousness of the slave. What he wants from the slave is not recognition, but work. As the requisite absolute reciprocity required in Hegel's account is missing in the Atlantic, according to Fanon, and we can talk about the problematic history here, there is no way for Fanon's slave to lose himself in the object the way Hegel's slave does and discover liberation through his work. Whereas the Hegelian bondsmen affect the object and in doing so transform themselves into the historical agents driving the next historical stage. For Fanon, the slaves, rather than defecting to the object, identify with the master and turn themselves, as it were, into the stillborn agents of status quo reproduction. The relations between slaves and masters in the Atlantic is dialectical, to be sure, and that the forms of self-consciousness come out of antagonistic, contradictory social interactions. Fanon's point is that the operation of self-consciousness dialectic in the Atlantic does not produce the collective self-consciousness described in Hegel's idealization. For Fanon, this makes the presupposition that ameliorative shapes of self-consciousness necessarily result from historical interactions conceptually problematic, indeed untenable. Applying the Hegelian dialectic to the concrete reality of slavery in the Atlantic, That may be problematic, but it reveals for Fanon a stalled dialectic in Fanon's view, one where the possibility of progress, in no way guaranteed to begin with, is mired in the slave's desire to be the oppressor, leaving the oppressed unable to imagine or instantiate power relations that do anything but secure the status quo. In other passages, Fanon goes further, calling into question, or at least expressing an ambivalence toward the very idea of a progress narrative. Or to put this somewhat differently, his preferred, still dialectical account of political possibility rests on the specific rejection of any vision of history with a capital H that imprisons actors in forces that are always already determinative or determining. There are, and obviously this is a quote, there are from one end of the world to the other men who are searching. I am not a prisoner of history. I must not look for the meaning of my destiny in that direction. I must constantly remind myself that the real leap consists of introducing invention into life. In the world I am heading for, I'm endlessly creating myself. I show solidarity with humanity, provided I can go one step further, and we see through one particular problem, the problem of action emerging. Fanon's version of existentialism does not give up on the dialectical method or even arguably on history per se, but on a view that makes its forces exhaustive, imprisoning, incapable of leaving room for creativity and innovation. His critique of history with that capital H does not mean abandoning dialectical reasoning or revolution or radical change. On the contrary, he adapts a dialectical method that allows him to diagnose a world in which dynamism and radicality are present and active through the co-implications and conflicts between social structures and human agency in the absence of any overarching determination or teleology. As social and structural antagonisms are not to be ruled out, neither can the possibility be dismissed that the result of a generative social dialectic operating over time could constitute a large-scale shift to relations based on recognitive reciprocity. A general condition in which a population of dialectically reasoning subjects pursue a reciprocity-based life together, animated, say, by practices of political respect and dignity, constant interrogation, and the striving for freedom, would in fact be the revolution. While Fanon was able to find no reason to expect with any confidence that humans would be able to manage such an outcome, it remained and remains the right thing to do, to struggle for it. This posit of an affirmative politics without the need for blinders is where Fanon's turn to Nietzsche is so crucial. Scholars have documented Nietzsche as the source, as well as for Césaire, of the sense of violence and physicality and immediacy that make Fanon's writing so vivid. Black Skin, White Masks also takes an unmistakable turn toward Nietzsche's amour fati, an orientation that says yes to life, to struggle, to freedom, to political action, and the possibilities of collective human emancipation without a recourse to teleological thinking or progress with that capital P, vowing he would never stop repeating it. Fanon declared that man is an affirmation. Whatever the ongoing debt to Hegel, the temporal structure we encounter here is Nietzschean in its circularity. Yes to life, yes to love, yes to generosity. Fanon continues, but man is also a negation. No to man's contempt, no to the indignity of man, no to the exploitation of man, the massacre of what is most human in man. And obviously I'm referring to the text itself. I think this is people, non-human agents to some extent. Freedom. Man's behavior is not only reactional, and there's always resentment or ressentiment in reaction. Nietzsche had already pointed that out in The Will to Power. To induce man to be actional by maintaining in all his circularity the respect for the fundamental values that make the world human, that is the task of the utmost urgency for he who, after careful reflection, prepares to act. Taking action here is to embrace affirmatively one's fate, as Nietzsche's version of anew underscores. The affirmation Fanon finds in Nietzsche is a will to power that models self-actualization in a brutal, colonized, racially structured world. Nietzsche's specific kind of affirmation is thus crucial for what Fanon calls the transmutation of the infinite colonized subject into a political agent. In the world I am heading for, he writes, I am endlessly creating myself. I am my own foundation. Fanon's embrace of Nietzschean affirmation entails recognizing that there's no way out of current conditions that neglects being alive to the world, its physicality, its poetry, its horror, and its beauty. That aliveness includes critique and intellectual honesty, but also, as Fanon says explicitly, generosity. This generosity in Fanon's hands entails humility, an embrace of politics without any guaranteed progress, an alertness to individual and collective contradictions in life in a racialized capitalist order as one way of beginning to undo it. Part 2, and I just love this picture. So in The Sublime Object of Ideology, Žižek proposes provocatively treating Hegel as the first post-Marxist theorist. Now, what he means is that politics is essentially about antagonism, not its resolution, and Hegelian dialectics, quote, far from being a story of progressive overcoming, amounts to a systematic notation of the failure of all such attempts. Žižek writes, absolute knowledge denotes a subjective position which finally accepts contradiction as an internal condition of every identity. In other words, Hegelian reconciliation is not panlogicist sublation of all reality in the concept, but a final consent to the fact that the concept is not all, to use the Lacanian term. In this sense, we can repeat the thesis of Hegel as the first post-Marxist. He opened up the field of a certain fissure subsequently sutured by Marx. That is, Marx offers resolutions for a set of problems he finds in Hegel when Hegel had already shown that problems of that sort are not to be solved. Resolution is impossible. The antagonism is all there is to count on. For Žižek, conceiving Hegelian dialectics as one conventional framing does, as a conceptual totality in which necessity devours contingency, gets things wrong. Part of what makes our ideals powerful is their elusiveness, which is at the heart of the contingently necessary acknowledgement of radical loss that attends our present moment, indeed all moments. To recognize the loss of a political ideal like democracy, which has always been impossible to achieve in practice, is to save it precisely by accepting its impossibility. Far from being cynical or defeatist, this position welcomes the insight that all attempts at symbolization or totalization or symbolic over-integration fail. Our world is rooted in antagonisms and in their congealment in contradictions, which cannot be overcome, and for Žižek generally should not be, because all the putative overcoming accomplishes is the retrospective postponement of a fundamental impossibility. Now, Žižek's construal of Hegelian dialectics, read through Lacan, might roil mainstream Hegelians. Indeed, I have colleagues who hate this reading. Here, however, the heterodox reading is not the important point, but what Žižek makes of what he finds in Hegel, which, as it happens, is in keeping with Fanon at his best. Together, they offer us, I want to submit, a salutary reading of politics as constantly in movement, as shaped by unattainable standards that are nevertheless worth striving for, and as tempered by the profound experiences of loss and lack that necessarily attend acting in the world. And we can talk a little bit more about the implications of when, say, we use the term loss and when we think about lack, because they aren't the same thing. Reading Fanon through Žižek's reading of Hegel, the business of the dialectic is not to resolve contradictions, but to deal in them, resisting the very idea of final reconciliation or stable closure, while at the same time representing the only meaningful naming of or gesture for these same unattainable standards that we have and in some respects share. Sometimes Žižek goes further, suggesting that for him, there is no way for justice or other such standards to be realized because any claimed realization would not be justice, but some totalitarian other devoid of conflict, contingency, and difference. In terms of my purposes here, what this means is that the idea of, say, justice can never be the same as justice translated into action. If only because the concept is not the same thing as its actualization, but they are related. In the language of dialectics, the concept is mediated through the lived experience of its actualization into something different from the concept in its immediate form. Moreover, and this may be what Žižek has in mind, given his indebtedness to Marx, the realization of any idea of justice as formal equality cannot but contain contradictions stemming from whatever social order it appears in the case of capitalism, a materially unequal one, so that contradictions inherent in the relation between standards of justice and our materially unjust social world is for both to be under constant reformulation, where both the concept and the social world are transformed in the context of ongoing antagonistic interactions without guaranteed progress. Moreover, it may be less reciprocal recognition than misrecognition that motors life along, as interactions are always shot through with failed connections. And in this view, the generalized outcome is not necessarily going to be an ameliorative politics, but more like something resembling a tragic comedy in which occasions for change and even radical solidarity appear in and emerge through our flawed, misrecognized encounters with others. Oopsie, here we go, sorry about that. Okay. So that gets us to part 3. In Mohammad Al Attar's play, While I Was Waiting, published in 2017 in the context of the Syrian revolution's devolution into civil war, we learn about political possibilities that can appear in the midst of what seems like crippling failure, as we witness Al Attar's characters grappling with their ongoing anguish, boredom, and exhaustion. How can nothing have changed after all that has happened, asks one of the play's protagonists. And as Jesse Green of the New York Times pointed out, it's precisely this negotiation of stasis in the midst of calamitous disruption that makes the play so compelling, and I would add, so provocative for theoretical reflection. Al Attar, portrays the effect of the destabilizing dissonance in what I'm calling slow burn sorrow, raising the question of what kind of politics might emerge from the shared affective atmosphere and effort at recalibration. So part 3 is going to look a little bit like this. I'm going to give you a very brief description of the play. I'm going to talk a bit about how Al Attar's play teaches us what it looks like to tarry with the negative. I'm going to bring into the conversation the psychoanalytic concept of depressive realism. I'm going to talk a bit about interpretive generosity and how we recuperate dialectical thinking as an awareness of the intractability of antagonism and the irresolvability of some of our contradictions. And I want to think a little bit more about a speculative register before concluding with some brief comments. So the play suggests that there's an answer to be found in people's lived experience of temporal dislocation and generational friction. It is a play about familial antagonism, time lived in limbo, and the hard work of mourning, where mourning involves the mounted loss of loved ones, but also the ongoing disappointment of not yet inhabiting the radical otherwiseness of their revolutionary aspirations. And for those of you who don't know, the Arab uprisings began in 2011. They began in March in Syria and devolved ultimately into a war that has at least partially ended with the toppling of the Assad regime in December 8, 2024. So this is in the midst of a civil war context that this play comes into being. Al Attar's plays figure not so much in the register of tragedy or hope, but as an exploration of the state of what in psychoanalysis is described as depressive realism. Depressive realism, I will submit, counterintuitively opens up political and temporal possibilities for critical reflection and ultimately renewed action. Let me give you a brief sense of the play's storyline and staging before turning more fully to this concept of depressive realism. So while I was waiting is set in 2015, 2016, as I mentioned at the beginning, when the exhilarating days of open-ended possibility and collective euphoria in the real world had given way to shattering disappointments and lethargic despair. Team, a 30-year-old former freelance designer and occasional DJ, has been filming the revolution, experimenting with montage and editing techniques to capture movement dynamics, and he now lies in a coma in Damascus. Injuries that are first traced to a strange accident will turn out to be the effects of a severe beating by regime thugs. Omar, his dear friend, was disappeared for his activism during the uprising, and the younger generations now in their 20s, 30s, and 40s are either whiling away days smoking hash or otherwise looking for exits, and all the time trying to make sense of the experience they've just been through. At least at this moment, the intoxicating sense of revolutionary promise has been dashed, and the lies and scandals bequeathed to them by an older generation have become too obvious to ignore. Team's coma is clearly a stand-in for the younger generation's state of indeterminacy, but equally for the damage done to young people by the Assad regime's ongoing brutality and by adults' complacency. Omar, too, is in limbo, hanging between life and death, as according to his own description, he, quote, became what remained of himself, unquote. Nor is relief to be found in what has become a disappointing political opposition, as Omar discovers when he joins Islamic militant groups and learns firsthand of the executions and the abhorrent violence perpetrated in the latter's prisons as well. We see families being fractured, cleaved along political lines, while also being torn asunder by the endless, relentless overt violence. Mother and daughter are reunited over the comatose team, their ongoing attachment registered in their constant disagreements. The women more generally in this play seem to want to reattach, despite the difficulties of doing so. As you can see, they're quite far apart in the staging here, to figure out how to navigate intimacy amid the ruins by asking indirectly, what can you do for your damaged loved ones? And how can we take care of ourselves in this time of neither here nor there-ness? The answer to this latter question, at least in the play, seems to be by confronting the past, even in the form of the ordinary conflicts that fracture families and hurt feelings, while also embracing a future that has to let some things go. Importantly, the play is free of any sense of resignation or cynicism. Al Attar's work, rather, presents us with an active aesthetic coming to terms with the necessary conditions for a new kind of radical politics. It's the second act, to use a theater metaphor, that itself performs the slow burn sadness it seeks to overcome. This is done, Al Attar teaches us, not by ignoring the negative, but tarrying with it. Tarrying with the negative in this sense describes the struggle to overcome the mawkish nostalgia associated with any simple version of sentimentality, while enlisting audiences in a world that is expressive of something Al Attar wants us to take seriously. The play's exposition of depressive realism is allied with the way that Lauren Berlant used the term. Whereas most people, Berlant tells us, quote, self-idealize, imagining themselves to be more beautiful and more efficacious than they are, depressive realists are, quote, more accurate. Their sense of realism isn't dark or tragic, but less defended against taking in the awkwardness and difficulty of living in the world, unquote. In Al Attar's version, depressive realism is what prompts the question he addresses through his art. How do Syrians, or for that matter, any activists trapped in war zones or exiled from their homes, continue to live without the hopes that motivated political aspirations for change during the revolution? How do people remain politically attached to worlds and situations absent the conditions of revolutionary camaraderie that bound people to one another in a previous moment? In a webinar commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising, Al Attar noted very much in the context of revolutionary disappointment and in this register of depressive realism, quote, I dance every day with depression, but I don't want depression to become a life companion, unquote. Acknowledging darkness while publicly forfending against it, Al Attar's plays, like some critical theory, attempt to work through what could be an overwhelming temptation to stay stuck and mired in the dark and tragic, while enacting a form of diagnosis which gives the state of the world, given the state of the world, has to be depressive to possess any generalized resonance. This fidelity to accuracy, indeed to a depressive realism, requires registering the oppressive forms of psychological, affective, and material domination that lead to despair, but also activating the imaginative, artistic, and activist practices that offer the promise of some repair. Like Fanon's appeal at the end of Black Skin, White Masks, Al Attar's plays are an instance of what I've called elsewhere interpretive generosity, an appeal to an audience at once Syrian and universal. He enacts the critical reflection that Žižek enjoins us to cultivate in his recuperation of dialectical thinking as an awareness of the intractability of antagonism and the irresolvability of many contradictions. For Al Attar, that contradiction is rooted in the struggle between familial love and political visions, highlighting the contradictions between the particular forces that anchor us to specific people and places and the general political aspirations for dignity and freedom. Al Attar deploys depressive realism as a speculative affective register, a looking for a way back to politics slowly and with an acknowledgement of uncertainty and sorrow. So at the end of Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon moves from acknowledging a grief that has no right to become mired by the determinations of the past, his words, to a repudiation of reparations. He writes, but I, a man of color, insofar as I have the possibility of existing absolutely, have not the right to confine myself in a world of retroactive reparations, unquote. Whatever we think of this view, for Fanon, the colonial subject loses a past that was never had in a dual sense. The past, which is filled with mystifications, was not theirs to begin with. White and black, all politically structured dichotomies, are frozen in a double negation in the image of the other. When Fanon refuses the binary, he opens things up, breathing life into an existential humanism where the black man and white man are not, and here I am quoting, both have to move away from the inhuman voices of their respective ancestors so that a genuine communication can be born. Before embarking on a positive voice, freedom needs to make an effort at disalienation. At the start of his life, a man is always congested, drowned in contingency. The misfortune of man is that he was once a child. Fanon recovers a humanism here that accommodates progress without requiring progress with a capital P, where life is scarcely to be separated from contingency and where, echoing Nietzsche, that contingency begins at birth. Disalienation may be another radical impossibility, like democracy or justice, to return to Žižek, a standard to strive for in the bearing of depressive realism, like Mohammad Al Attar, whose recognition that we are bound never fully to succeed does not relieve us of the responsibility of trying. And when we fail, we need to mourn that failure, as Nadia Bouali and Rebecca Comey's work both bring to the fore. An effort at disalienation cannot be fully realizable, not only because our lives are structured by capitalism's fundamentally alienating condition, but even were we able to upend capitalism because our very constitution as human beings make us alienated from the get-go. In this sense, alienation is a condition for which the dis is the standard for ongoing struggle, a dialectical move in which process is progress with a small p. This dialectical move, embracing a non-linear, non-teleological lived experience of struggle, can come with the sense of an out-of-jointness of time, to borrow David Scott's apt formulation and to return to him at the end, which is itself a borrowing from Shakespeare's Hamlet, of course. This present is, for the most part, devoid of the radical longing for total revolution that enlivened emancipatory politics from the late 18th through much of the 20th century. What we have instead are people flailing while, amid multiple defeats, striving to embrace an affirmative, imaginative politics, to link past sorrows to new beginnings, and to make sense of circumstances that continue to be reliably disappointing and happily, occasionally startling. Thank you. There's a lot there.
So we have Q&A that you feel your own questions on, so we'll go into.
Do you want to field them? I mean, you might know people. I feel like I might not be able.
Sure, Bob.
It's a very good question. You obviously thought of this, and this is where I thought you were going. Why did you contrast depressive realism with cruel optimism? I could go on. I mean, I thought I was following you, and then you didn't say that. And I'm wondering why, because it seems to me what you're doing is talking about a politics that is neither about teleology, which is where you started, or transcendence, nor is it about justice in the sense of reversal or liberation. So there's cruelty and there's optimism, and there's realism and there's depression. And I'm wondering whether you can put those pieces together a little bit more.
Yeah, well, of course, Berlant is the one who made famous cruel optimism, and for them, cruel optimism is about being attached to circumstances, an object, a thing that is no longer doing affirming work. And so that is very important to a longer story that I would tell, but it's not where anybody wants to end up. Whereas I think depressive realism actually suggests a way, dare I say, forward with a small f, not with a guarantee of progress or with a justice that requires a kind of going back, but that is something that we need to work through as part of a process through which progress with a small p or a certain ameliorative circumstances can be not only imagined but made real. And so in some ways, cruel optimism is that thing one doesn't want to continue to do, whereas depressive realism is something I think we have to embrace.
Without pessimism. Without
pessimism and without cynicism. It's more active than pessimism. It doesn't allow you to stay mired in that. It requires that hard work of mourning, and also a fidelity to an accuracy that continuously requires updating and an openness to possibilities that you wouldn't otherwise see. So a constant need to detach, in fact, at the same time that one is making some form of attachment happen. Thank you.
Thank you for that. My head is still spinning a little bit. It was wonderful. And I was wondering at the beginning how you were going to thread these thinkers together, and it was a masterclass.
Thank you.
I will say that I have a little bit of third worldist nostalgia in me. And so part of my reaction to your opening comments was one of resistance.
Yeah.
And in putting these thinkers together, something I was wrestling with was we're also thinking about different geographies of liberation. And so if we're thinking about the post-socialist, post-colonial world, and perhaps the region of the world that you and I work on, is there a way in which the legacy of the third worldism are conjugated differently in this, rough and tumble mixture of mourning and antagonism? Thinking about this through Algeria, the impossible desire for revolution, even as it's gotten reconjugated, is still very much animating protests, even in a kind of weird hybrid neoliberal present. And so I'm wondering if, what we make of these societies where third worldism was a concrete lived form, right? It wasn't just a doctrine, it was something that was embedded in kind of the existential everyday, life. And so I guess part of that is thinking about how this plays out differently. Part of it is a perhaps nostalgic appeal to the relevance of this utopian desire, even if it's not realizable, as something that drives people. And so, I would just be curious to hear you think through the different geographies of liberation as you put these thinkers together who are thinking about the post-socialists, but from very different positions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's actually, I'm hearing two questions. So maybe I'll parse it, and then if I got it wrong, then, and one is about the kind of differentiation here, that not everyone is experiencing this narrative of teleological progress as dead as I'm making it out to be by embracing Scott. And that has to do in part with different colonial legacies, different histories of revolution. That's on the one hand. And the second question I heard from you was really, it's related, but I hear it as also slightly different, which is, what might be the relevance of utopian desire? That utopian desire doesn't have to take the form of progress with a capital P. So that's why I want to distinguish them a little bit from one another. And I think on the first part, you were right. There are people who still subscribe to this progress narrative, and you don't even have to be a leftist to subscribe to it. I mean, modernization theory was like this as well in its own way. We don't want to subscribe to that, so we won't bother with it. But there are different geographies of struggle for sure. And I don't mean to ride roughshod over that. So on the one hand, I guess what I want to say is that there is enough despair and disappointment, even though we may in some ways want to continue to hang on to that progress narrative, that it's worthy of the intellectual exercise. Well, what if we gave it up? What would that look like? And who's the we that's doing that? Will look different in different places, and it will depend on the kind of attachments that coalesce with these narratives. So Scott himself starts this project very much with the Grenada, the invasion of Grenada, and that transforms his own understanding of progress. And of course, he publishes that book as the Arab uprisings are underway. And in some ways, you could make the argument, well, there's a different kind of revolution that's coming to the fore there. And there was, as you know better than most, there were a lot of arguments among leftists, is this really revolution or not? And I actually don't want to participate in that. If people are understanding this as revolution, I'm fine with calling it revolution. It doesn't look the same, though, as these versions of Marxist revolution in the past. And so maybe it is in the service of a broader sort of commitment to curiosity and intellectual generosity to not have to have revolution tethered to progress. So that despite the geographical differences and things like that, there might be an important imaginative exercise here. And without getting into whether, X is a revolution or a bona fide revolution or not. But also the relevance of utopian desire is part of an imaginative practice that I think we do need to cultivate, in part because we need those standards to do any kind of ameliorative actualization. We just also need to know that those are standards and that they aren't the same thing as its actualization, and that we are going to be doing that dialectical work and also doing that kind of reparative work as we continue to move forward. But to be mired in despair really, it can be an option for a day or a week or a month, but over time we have to get out of our fetal balls and start to recommit. And in that commission, if you will, a recommitment, we do need to take into consideration all of the paths not taken, or the forms, to use Adorno's term, the otherwiseness that hasn't been taken up so far, some of which will be more utopian than others. And whenever there's an allergy to utopian thinking, I'm interested in that. I want to nuzzle up to that. Like, what's wrong with a little bit of utopianism now and again? But with that kind of also dollop, to use a recipe metaphor, of depressive realism in there as well, that this may not even be desirable to be actualized. It may have a kind of, as Žižek would suggest, a kind of totalizing function that might be scary in its own right. And yet there are standards that need to be strived for. So, yeah.
We have one question from the Zoom, which I'll just read aloud to you.
Sure.
Question is, this is from Jennifer Gonzalez, and the question is, thank you for this thoughtful talk. In your emphasis on affect as one of several paths back to the political, I wonder how you view the work of Chantal Mouffe in terms of affective identification. And then Max has a question.
Yeah, I'm very respectful and indebted to Chantal Mouffe and their understanding of and the importance they bring to bear of an affective politics. And I do think that one of the problems with conventional politics in the United States at the moment is that the Democratic Party, which of course is so disappointing, it makes me want to not even go to just be depressed without any of the salutary aspects of depressive realism. The incapacity of left liberals to be able to appreciate or incorporate affect into their politics is part and parcel, it seems to me, of why it is we are where we are. That the radical right has been able to embrace an affective politics with its moral sadism and toxicity that is very much beholden to an affective register that the much of the left has, or liberal left in any case, has not been able to subscribe to. So I appreciate Mouffe in that register, and also the kind of the indebtedness, if you will, to a kind of Gramscian understanding of the importance of an optimism of the will, while maintaining. I mean, you could say that depressive realism is a bit like that pessimism of the intellect, if you will, but with the optimism of the will as well. But I'm very appreciative of Mouffe, and I should go back and reread Laclau and Mouffe as well in order to enrich this paper. So I appreciate the suggestion.
In the stack of Max and Nick.
Thank you for your talk. You started with a statement of the teleology and emancipation without teleology. And then you ended by talking about the openness and the possibility for openness. I think this tension between the end of teleology and openness, that is quite interesting. And the first thing comes to my mind is an historical parallel. So something like that happened also in the 20s and 30s, in the 20th century. So people like Walter Benjamin, Ernst Bloch, and even Martin Heidegger, they were struggling with a similar tension. And I think this is quite interesting, and not only because of the same theoretical problem is coming back.
Yes.
That is related to our sense of a stuckness. How can we liberate the present? How can we liberate the present if we don't have the compass of a teleology that gives us some orientation, some direction? So is the sense is the feeling is to be lost in the present and to be stuck. But then there is a second dimension that is not only theoretical, but is related to the theoretical dimension, that is the political one. You know, in the 20s and 30s, those people were struggling against fascism. So against basically the fact that so many possibilities for liberation, emancipation were or got exhausted. And then is how can we rethink openness? So my first question is a kind of a, does it make sense to think that basically we are still dealing with the same problem that we as a cosmopolitan global thinkers we had in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century, that is basically this attention between the loss of a compass teleology and how to restore a sense of openness. And for those people, the way to restore the openness, especially Bloch and Benjamin, was to restore the openness in the past.
Right.
So if we are not able to restore this openness of the past, because it's related to teleology, because teleology works primarily to organize the past, so that the past can make sense. And if we really give up on teleology, the past becomes something sparkling, bubbling, is almost chaotic. But the point is to find possibilities in that chaos, and that can liberate possibilities for the present. So this is my first comment question. You know, this kind of a parallel. Are we basically the question is, are we dealing?
Let her answer that before we forget what you're.
The question is, are we dealing with that problem that basically is rooted in the crisis of how do you say, of modernity, of modern thought, and it is related to the fact that the loss of a compass teleology is also affects our capability of thinking in terms of openness and possibility, and we're just dealing with this tension.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that is similar, or as to use your word, where there's a real parallel that's worth exploring. I used to have in this paper, the longer version, the actual paper still has a discussion of Benjamin in here as well. I took it out of the talk. I think, it's enough theorists in this talk as it is. But also because I thought I needed to do more justice to the kinds of issues that you're talking about that Benjamin raises. And I thought, oh, this could actually, at one point when I'm thinking chapters of a book, I think this needs to be another chapter. And in thinking that, and I'm imagining the Angel of History, for example, the clay painting that Benjamin takes so imaginatively and seriously. My reading of it is that it's not an actually abandonment of teleology. It is an abandonment of the positive narrative around teleology, but there is still a movement that's happening, and it is still where the winds and debris are piling up, and the angel is, as is facing the debris, but is moving forward by virtue of his back. But there is that kind of forward movement there. And so and there's a lot of tension in those theses around his fidelity to a certain Marxist narrative of progress and his efforts to complexify it. That gets me to the second part of your first question, which is what happens to the past here. And it's interesting that Arendt, in her opening tribute to Benjamin in Illuminations, talks, so as you know probably better than I, about recovering the lost treasures of the past, and she likens it to pearl diving, where you and I keep thinking about, oh, well, the pearl diving is such a dangerous profession, and the exploitation of those work. Like, why are we needing pearl divers to get to this? So I don't love the metaphor, but I appreciate the kind of the sort of attention or attunement to the way in which the past can be recovered in some way to help inform the future. That is very different than a kind of mawkish nostalgia. And I think it's very different than necessarily subscribing to the temporality implied in teleology. One can appreciate a past without thinking even linearly about it. One can appreciate aspects of the past while, thinking in bricolage forms about. I mean, there are lots of ways to imagine or envision aesthetically a recuperation of certain aspects of the past, and indeed the possibilities of repair entailed in that, without thinking either that one has to wholly subscribe to a teleological view or indeed recover additional aspects of the past or romanticize those aspects of the past. And so I want to think more about what aspects of the past would be politically salutary for an emancipatory politics in the present, where we operate, to use another Arendtian sort of phrase, between past and future. And the other thing I wanted to say is that you had at the beginning, I thought your question was going to go another way. I never say emancipation. I say emancipatory politics, because I want to use the adjectival form as opposed to the settled, congealed nominative form. I think it makes a difference in the way we think about it and allows for a kind of openness, for sure, with tensions, but not necessarily the same tension when we have the solidified now.
Lisa, thank you so much. I really love the way you bring together high philosophy with actual politics and history. I want to zoom in on the philosophical dimension for a moment, and then maybe we can go to the political implications together. You talked about the structure of the dialectic, and in the early part of your talk, when you're talking about the movement of history by way of contradiction, you suggested that the negation of the negation should be understood not as a synthesis, but as a sublation. Mm-hmm. This is, of course, a very important intervention in and of itself, because it dispels all naive expectations about a final reconciliation, a transparent society in which the contradiction between humans and nature, or humans and other humans, are entirely overcome. Mm-hmm. That in and of itself is very, very important. But from there, it seemed to me that by way of Žižek in particular, the next move was to say, since we are not able to strive for a synthesis, then we have to embrace the impossibility of removing contradiction. Mm-hmm. That contradictions are there to stay. And I wonder if there's not another way to look at the structure of the dialectic, in which the problem is not only the negation of the negation understood as sublation, but now in a more open-ended way, but rather to see the negation of the negation as leading to the emergence of something entirely new. And in my understanding of the history of Western philosophy, there are very few thinkers who have been able to consider the negation of the negation as the production of something new. And that I associate with the lineage of Machiavelli, Gramsci, Althusser. And therefore, in that constellation, and I would situate Fanon there too, in this, if we look at the structure of the dialectic. Now, this puts Fanon and Žižek in tension with one another. And I think it wouldn't be entirely inaccurate to trace that tension into politics, because Fanon is at the end of the day a revolutionary. And I think one needs to have the belief in the possibility of the emergence of something new in order to give one's life to politics in a way that Žižek can never do and will never do. No offense to Žižek's fans. But the point in this new, it seems to me, is not that contradictions are going to go away, or that they're inevitable, as in the Žižekian, but that there will be entirely new contradictions to deal with because there's something new. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about that, because that is something different. I mean, it moves the conversation away from our dispositions toward reality, whether it's pessimistic, optimistic, depressive or not, despairing or not, but toward how to first grasp the new when it emerges, or to think of the conditions of, to think of the new in the absence of its emergence.
Okay, this is a complicated question, and I'll start where you started at the beginning. Thank you very much. This is I'm not going to do justice to it at the moment, but I'm going to try to think aloud with you. So the first thing I would say is that I think one can think in terms of sublation without and I think that Žižek himself doesn't think in terms of synthesis. I think he does think in terms of sublation. So I don't think that's where the heart of your question is. I think in thinking about the negation of the negation, you said that that can produce something, and I'm quoting you here, entirely new. And that's where I would want to push back a little bit. I don't think there's such a thing as entirely new. And so, but new, yes, but entirely new, the force of that suggests something that is, fundamentally out of whole cloth. And that I think is impossible. And it actually gets back to Massimo's question in a way, that there are always going to be residual aspects of the past that are carried in through a present that is different from it, and where there's the possibility of novelty there as well. So I want to just, you were just speaking off the cuff, so maybe you didn't mean entirely, but I think it's an important point to think about the political stakes in recognizing that nothing is really entirely new, even when some forms of revolution try to make things entirely new by changing the calendar or revamping street names or however else that tends to happen. I think that there is a tension that you rightly point out, and one that I want to productively play with, between an understanding of reproduction that is in a kind of Žižekian register, one that is much more difficult to get out of than the kind of Gramscian register, where the dynamics of reproduction enable new things to emerge, and for possibilities of improvisation and council politics and Gramsci's historical version of things to emerge. And that's one of the reasons that Hall ultimately actually sides with Gramsci over Althusser. Maybe that's a misreading of Althusser in your version, but precisely because there's more room for openness and creativity and there's a mobility or agility to politics that isn't there in the Žižekian form. With Žižek too, and this is one of the things I glossed over, I mentioned it, but not particularly well in the talk, was that, for him, any kind of reconciliation of a contradiction is potentially totalizing and therefore needs to be, discarded or not signed up or not subscribed to. And, there are plenty of historical contradictions whose resolution, to the extent that they've been resolved, haven't been bad. They've been actually kind of good. So there is a kind of worry on his part of a kind of totalization that he also reproduces in the way that he understands the world that I think needs to be interrogated. Having said that, there is a way in which his version of reproduction allows us or invites us, beckons us to deal with the formidable challenges of change in a way that other theorists, it seems to me, are too sanguine about. And so there's a part of me that wants to stick with Žižek a little longer than maybe makes me even comfortable, because of not in order to despair, but in order to say, okay, here are the formidable challenges that I need to think about how to overcome. Here are the impasses that we might want to entertain together on how to scale these impasses in order to move forward. That if one sits with a kind of account of the social dynamics of reproduction that feel somewhat totalizing, what might that get us in terms of a purchase on the new that we wouldn't have had otherwise? And I think it's important to play with that in the context of a depressive realism, because otherwise we get too happy too fast or too sanguine too fast, and I worry about that.
It's okay. I'm going to interject my own question now. Because it kind of follows up a little bit on what Fanon is saying. So first of all, thank you very much. I admit also, as Miriam says, to a certain kind of attachment or let's say nostalgia to a different kind of revolutionary politics. And part of it comes from my sense that the type of response to that you're describing, which could be maybe broadly characterized as a sort of negative metaphysics, actually tends to reinscribe precisely the kind of totalizing move that it claims to be avoiding. And it does that in a philosophical register, and then there's, I think, political implications for it. So I'll kind of like overstate the case just to sharpen the distinction. But in the philosophical register, it usually takes the form of saying something like that, like in the Žižekian form, that absolute knowledge is not a final reconciliation and a totalizing form of knowledge, but is rather a recognition of the impossibility of that fact. But the philosophical sleight of hand, of course, comes from the moment of, but what is that moment? What is the description of the recognition of that impossibility? Is it a cognitive apprehension of something? Is it a sort of a greater level of knowledge? Is it an affective register, a kind of disposition whereby it sort of resonates, or in a kind of Heideggerian language, it's not a conceptual or cognitive moment, but a kind of a moment of recognition of that impossibility. That seems to me again to bring back that totalizing move, even as it claims to be disavowing. And that has political implications for me, because it tends to take then the negative, and you describe it in highly abstract metaphysical terms. The languages that you use throughout the talk were like impossibility, lack, and loss. And one term that is also associated with the negative, but for me is a much more political term, is defeat. So it takes questions of political conflict and turns it into a metaphysical question of loss or metaphysical impossibility of closure. And by foreclosing any language about defeat, it doesn't allow us to see that some of these things, someone else is winning. It's not that we have lost or that there is a generalized human impossibility, but rather that one party has succeeded at the expense of others. So in other words, the generalized metaphysical language of impossibility, lack, and loss imagines actually a very unified subject that like any humans need to, right? Whereas the language of defeat, because it's a political and relational language, imagines that someone is winning at the expense of someone else. And so that gets very obfuscated, I think, by the kind of metaphysical language of a generalized impossibility of succeeding amongst us humans. And that is another kind of sleight of hand that I guess I worry a little bit about in that language.
Yeah, so I don't see, I mean, it's very interesting that you think of that as metaphysical. I think of it as political, and I think of it as tied to our ordinary language of what we're doing when we invoke a standard, which I think of as very much in the concrete real of the political. So that when we invoke the standard of justice, what are we doing when we invoke that standard? And you know, for me, the theorist that I would look to, other than Žižek here, is Wittgenstein, and it would be very much along the lines of the way in which we understand the grammar of the word justice to connote certain kinds of things. We have some understanding of the grammar of the world because we use it to connect us to certain actions in the world. Our very speech is an action in its own right, et cetera, et cetera. And so I see that as allied here with the way that I'm using Žižek, which may not be what Žižek intends, but I don't really care what Žižek intends. I do think that you're right that the psychoanalytic predisposition, and I promised that if anybody raised this, I would talk a little bit more about this, that I've gotten this pushback. I've only given this talk 2 other times. This is very new for me, this work, so I'm really appreciating you guys helping me out here. But the difference between lack and loss here, in Žižek, it almost gets alive in the sense that, you know, given his fidelity to a certain Lacanianism that in students sometimes gets even reduced to, you know, the horror of castration, very psychoanalytic version of this. I think that the kind of object cause of desire that is implied in a Lacanian understanding of lack has profound consequences politically for the way we act in the world. In the way that we understand the concept in relationship to what we can do to realize a version of it. Having said that, there's another version of loss that I have in this paper that is really the more concrete loss that Mohammad Al Attar's play brings to the fore, which is just the sadness of so many loved ones and ideas being part of the debris of history, to use the Benjaminian sort of imagery. So that isn't the loss of that isn't the lack that Žižek's talking about. It that is the concrete sadness that attends what it means to lose a lot of people you care about, and the bodies piling up. The reason I don't use defeat and use revolutionary disappointment instead of defeat is because for me, defeat is too closed. And it reminds me of this Žižekian joke, or at least a joke that Žižek tells, when in the 1950s, Zhou Enlai is going to Geneva, and a reporter allegedly asks him, so, you know, you're in Europe, so what do you think of the French Revolution? And he responds, it's too early to tell. So this is in the 1950s. And we experienced this, many of us who, cared a great deal about the Arab uprisings of 2011, that there were people who were pronouncing the defeat or the failure of these. And defeat and failure are aligned concepts here. They're not the same thing. Failure has a different kind of evaluative concern. I agree with that, but you were going to tell me that and I just heard it. But it is true that there is a sort of a sense that something has been kind of closed off here and pronounced, defeated, gone. And I do take that joke seriously enough to imagine that I don't want to, it is too early to tell. And if we were, writing in 1942 about Nazi Germany, we would write very differently than we would write about Nazi Germany in 1967. So I think that defeat sort of pronounces an end in advance of a kind of ongoing processual political world. But having said that, there are also times where we not only feel defeated, but there are objective ways in which we could say this is the standard within which, this is defeated. And that would make a certain amount of sense to me. But I do tend to want to shy away from something that closes off the ongoing possibilities, the sort of forms of disruption that are available to us, even when it looks like our worlds are fundamentally foreclosed.
Thank you for your talk. Thanks for traveling here to be with us. It was really excellent and provocative and clarifying. I wanted to ask you about some terms that you used as you used them and as I understood them. Progress, capital T progress, teleology, action, where action is the thing that is missing from progress, teleology. And then the fourth term is process, which you used at the end as maybe an alternative to capital P progress. So the thing that we bristle at in capital P progress is not just that it's not just that we know what the end is, the end being justice or something, but also that we will arrive at justice without having to do anything, without having to act or make any kind of intervention into the given reality, so that the movement toward justice is already baked into the given reality and would kind of be there even if we weren't here.
Social forces.
Yeah, like without human action. So, and then tearing with the negative, as you say, or this depressive realism, what it does is prevents us from reconciling ourselves to the given reality, and thus holding open the space or potential for action. So it kind of it's not action, but it continuously reasserts the imperative to act. So and then at the end, you invoked process, which I seemed like you were maybe putting forward as an alternative to capital T progress.
Process as progress.
Okay. So doing this is the interesting thing for me is that one would need to define it against capital T progress, yes, but also against I don't know, kind of like natural evolution or something. So it's like process as progress toward an end that is not given because it requires action, but also not something that's just going to happen through a kind of evolutionary process that's already baked into the present.
Yes.
So what do we call that?
Uh, what do we call that kind of process?
Yeah, or maybe, but you're already calling it, process as progress, maybe you could
Yes.
say a bit more about
Yeah. Yeah.
process, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. I guess I don't spend much time on the evolutionary aspect of it in part there, I have a footnote somewhere, in part because I don't think most of my readers are going to subscribe to that. So it doesn't need the same.
Or maybe Santa Cruz and Chicago.
Yes. So there's that, but I hear you, and I guess, I guess I would call it a dialectical processes progress. That really what I'm trying to do is to think about the dialectic in this way, that where the emphasis is on the process as opposed to the progress, but where one gets one by way of the other, but not in a kind of linear or necessarily guaranteed ameliorative way. But yes, it is a kind of effort to reinvigorate or give a kind of concreteness to the abiding structure, agency, dialectical tension, where they co-implicate each other without necessarily resolving that tension. But yeah, thank you. I need to do a little bit more with that, and I appreciate your intervention.
Thank you so much.
We're almost out of time, so maybe we could take the last two questions together and then you can kind of.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was a pleasure and an inspiration. As someone who does think psychoanalytically, I was really happy to hear this turn, especially within political theory, to thinking within possibility, lack, and loss. And I really appreciated the early moment in the talk when you talked about how Fanon's sense of identity was undercut precisely by this sense of the dialectic that interrupts arrival, that feels almost Stuart Hall-esque in its commitment to processual becoming rather than being of identity. And I think that avenue of coming back into a sense of identity constituted by the impossibility of wholeness is what allows for that critique of negritude in Black skins. It is what allows for that critique of postcolonial nationalism that once achieved is hollowed from within in the very instant of its arrival. And so there's something profoundly psychoanalytic about, I think, Fanon's understanding of the constant temporal interruption, both of nostalgia's backward glance and of, for lack of a better words, getting its arrival. And this is, I think, one of the things that is his commitment to the temporality of the unstable, the in-between, the occult, the spectral, the hauntological, whatever. My thought has often turned that way with Fanon. So there's something about thinking through impossibility, lack, and loss that helps us re-engage the subject of freedom. We might even want to call it the subjective age of freedom, but also the object of freedom itself, because that object too is a psychoanalytic kind of object, and it is one that is not whole in its own terms, right? It is one constituted also by its inability to be gotten.
Yes.
Or
yes.
had.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking a lot about how that notion is really fundamental to small f freedom as opposed to big F freedom, to freedom that in my reading has been liberated from the dialectic in order to do this different kind of agential work. And this is not related, but I'm very interested in this question about how the temporality of form is so central to this talk. So you do this beautiful reading of a play, and I'm thinking about how important the category of tragedy is in Fanon's thinking, and David Scott's as well, as a form that is precisely about short circuitings, closures,
mourning, etc. I'm thinking about Fanon's account of the settler as an epic that never finishes, thinking about Fanon's own playwriting, but there's something about the passage through particular forms, and you happen to have chosen one, drama, heavy on development and denouement and closure, and also saturated with mourning. And it's a form that is itself being worked through to open up to a form that is not dictated by its generic codes, because it wants to hold and also go beyond all those deaths it mourns. It wants to be a lightning bolt.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm just thinking, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about these forms of mourning, prediction, catalyst, prophetic diagnosis, because we're all watching what mourning accomplishes in the field of political right now too. Why is it that we always knew it would be deaths that started something like the resistance, but there's something about that form that we must actually think politically about its appeal, its urgency, its short circuit. So, sorry to that.
No,
But you made me very excited.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very appreciative.
I feel almost guilty to present another question after such a rich engagement with your work. Thank you so much for this presentation, Professor Wedeen, and it was very elucidating. I want to begin this question by saying that I am not as fluent as I would like to be in Fanon's oeuvre. So some interpretations of the moments of his work, they may be misrepresentatory, and I want to be sensitive to that. But I had the good fortune of recently attending a workshop on Fanon's Dialectic at a conference in decolonization and global justice. And one interpretation of Wretched of the Earth that was really present in this workshop was a certain teleological interpretation. And it was that the dialectic of history necessitates a movement through modernist forms of statehood to attain racial and ethnic recognition on a global scale. And this is a view that was attributed to Fanon over the course of this workshop. And the stakes of this view are also that it prevented him or created a stumbling block in his engagement with indigenous activism, which does not always and not necessarily want to move through modernist forms of statehood, statehoods that are supposedly meant to guarantee our rights and our recognition, but would rather rely on certain forms, whether modulated or not, from past forms of social living and more communal ways of guaranteeing those rights. But with this teleological viewing of Fanon, it's difficult to understand how we could pull from those indigenous forms of communal liberation. So I'm thinking specifically of Kyle White in this moment, who talks about circular temporalities, where ancestral knowledge from the past and ancestral forms of community can come to inform future possibilities. So what I'm asking, because you talk about temporal possibilities in your engagement with depressive realism, and this idea that the future has to let some things go. If this is, a worthy interpretation of Fanon, are there some parts of his teleology that your depressive realism is willing to let go, including this kind of necessity for national recognition, guarantee of rights and recognition on a global stage?
Yeah, great. Well, those are phenomenal questions, and I really am not going to be able to do justice to them. So pick and choose a few things, and I don't want to, we're all already over time. So just to say, one of the reasons I don't use Wretched of the Earth in this talk is precisely because in Wretched of the Earth, many of the tensions that I find so fertile to work with are just not there in the same way. It's more of a manifesto. It's extraordinarily, it's wonderful, and but it's also kind of wonderfully incoherent in a different way than Black Skin, White Mask complexes, and it does sort of hardwire into the narrative a certain kind of confidence in the progress narrative that I think the earlier work doesn't do. So that's why I prefer that. So, and you know, thank you so much for this. I hope we'll have a chance to talk a lot more, because that was just an extraordinary. I thought recently a lot about what it is about the form of theater, just to take the that might have a certain kind of revolutionary capacity that other forms of artistic expression don't have. And I guess, you know, and certainly the theater as a metaphor is often used in political theory studies. Hannah Arendt often uses the spectator, the actor, and of course there are wonderful playwrights. You know, think about folks like Brecht and Beckett, whose revolutionary theatrical works are so important. And it is true in the context of the Syrian uprising too, that folks like Mohammad Al Attar and other playwrights and dramaturgists would go around the countryside and enliven people's ordinary lives by having them act out possibilities for change. So this had an actual concrete set of benefits for young people whose schooling was being disrupted by war, for example, very important. And it does seem to me that one thing one might say about theater more generally is that on the one hand, there's a kind of scriptedness to the play by, I mean, we can take certain improv, but on the other hand, there's always the risk of a kind of creative disruption, not only in the interpretation of the script, but in, you know, forgetting your lines, or in interpreting differently, or in the audience's reaction, or the experimental pedagogical possibilities in having the audience become part of the play. And so it does seem to me that I don't want to go as far as saying it is the revolutionary. I mean, that would be kind of, I also find a tremendous amount of possibility in comedy, for example, for the kind of disruptive capacities of comedy ensemble, which can be theatrical ensemble, which are not. But it does strike me as that theater may have a particular affinity with politics. And to close by just returning to a part of your question, Robert, that I didn't answer, I don't think we have to choose, and this gets to another issue you raised, between the cognitive apprehension and the affective resonance. It strikes me that politics has got to interweave both of those things, and without doing that, and the theater is a good way to enlist or solicit that kind of recruitment. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming.